pick a place and then you hear their music and you're like, oh, well, whatever they are, they've got cool music. Like they do hip hop slightly differently. So maybe I was afraid of them before, but but before we fight, can you play me another one of those songs?
What's going on? Welcome to the New Music Business. I'm your host, Ari Herstand, author of How to Make It in the New Music Business, the book. Third edition is out now everywhere. Audiobook, ebook, hardcover, however you consume books, you can find the book now everywhere. Today, my guest is Glenn McDonald. Glenn, for about a decade, was the data alchemist at Spotify. He started at the company The Echo Nest, which was then acquired by Spotify in 2014. And he is essentially the guy who more or less wrote the Spotify algorithm in terms of how genre works and fans also like works. The daily mixes, pretty much just how all of the algorithm kind of works at Spotify in terms of listenership and taste and genre and all of that. Glenn was a part of. He was leading that team, and his fingerprints are all over Spotify and every aspect of Spotify. Now, I use the past tense because this past December, Glenn was caught up in the massive layoffs that Spotify conducted in December 23, impacting about 17% of the company. I'm sure you heard about it. And so he no longer works at Spotify, but his legacy continues. And, we reference a bit of his work, and you can still find a lot of it. If you go to everynoise.com, you can see kind of, and I would encourage everybody to do this, you can see kind of the list of genres that we're discussing, the over 6,000 genres that he or someone on his team created, literally wrote these names of all these genres. You can see the site map, and they're color coded, and they all correspond to playlists with at least like 100 artists per each playlist. So it's just fun as like a music fan. It's fun to do, and it's fun to fall down this rabbit hole. Seeing kind of how all these artists and sounds and genres are connected or not. So throughout this conversation, you get a good history on kind of how Spotify's algorithms and playlists came to be, where they're at now, or at least where they were in December of 23 when Glenn left, but not to my eyes, not much has really changed. We get into what did happen with Fans Also Like. I think for those of you that have been paying attention, you'll know that changed dramatically last year, and he talks about what happened and why it happened, and he was part of that. And we also talk about streaming fraud and artificial streaming bots, bot attacks, scammers, fraudsters, all of that. We get into that for a bit. And we just kind of have a conversation and about his work kind of with data alchemy, I guess. I've never really heard that term before, but he's the data alchemist, and with personalization and how all that works within the largest and most important streaming service in the world right now. You can find Glenn's work right now still at, I mentioned everynoise.com, but you can also visit his blog, furia.com, furia.com. He regularly is writing blog posts, and you can kind of go back to the archive and get a little bit more insight into kind of how he thinks and works and what he's working on. You can find him on Twitter, twitter.com/Glenn, that's 2Ns_McDonald, on LinkedIn. And you can find all of us that make the show happen at Ari's Take on Instagram, TikTok, X, I guess Twitter, X, whichever you call it, Threads. You can find me at Ari Herstand on Instagram. Visit aristake.com to get on the email list. That's actually the best way that we can get in touch with you, and you can get in touch with us and just hear more about new episodes and anything that's happening in the new music business that we think you should know about. So go to Aristake to get on that email list. But right now, if you could just pause this episode and leave us a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or however you're listening to this right now. And if you're on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and subscribe or follow, or if you want this show to continue in your podcast feed, please subscribe and follow this show. All right, let's kick into the show. Glenn McDonald, welcome to the show.
Thanks.
Hi. I'm so excited to talk with you. For many years, I should start by saying that I think everybody listening, whether they know it or not, knows your work, and millions of people around the world are familiar, whether they know your name or not, with your legacy. And so for those that are kind of very new, I would love for you to just kind of give a brief overview of what your job was at Spotify, and just kind of what you spent a lot of your time doing over the years, even pre-Spotify, and just kind of what were your muses and what was your focus for the better part of the last decade or so?
Sure. So I'll start a little before a decade ago. I spent
Great.
a couple decades as a software designer, designing various things, team collaboration software and an online service, and various tools for data collection for various companies. And none of those were meant for music data, but I would always use them on music data because that was what I was interested in. And so along the way, I did a bunch of data projects about music, and I wrote a music review column for 10 years. And for a while, I tabulated the Village Voice Music Critic poll. So I'd done a bunch of little music things. And the course of my career I've always worked for startups or startup projects that eventually end up either getting acquired or in layoffs, or one of the corporate ends. And so periodically I needed a new job. And in 2011, when Google bought the company I was working at, finally I knew that there were some people from the Media Lab who had started a company to do music data stuff. And I was like, a job doing music data? Fascinating. Maybe I should do that. And I talked to them, and they agreed that maybe I should do that. So that was called the Echo Nest. And the Echo Nest was a startup trying to do music recommendations and other sort of music analytical stuff as a service for streaming services, which there were a few of at that point. And so the biggest deal we ended up having was running all the sort of radio and recommendations functions for RDO, which people who've been around for a while may remember. It was a streaming service. It was very nice. It looked nice. It had you could review albums. It had like a social component that pretty much nobody has replicated since. And as a back end company, we were trying to get customers however we could. And so anything that got us attention was good. So my habit of doing random side projects was super helpful because it got attention to the things that we were actually selling. And it was pretty clear, even when I started the Echo Nest in 2011, that this Swedish service, Spotify, which hadn't even launched in the US yet at that point, was the one we really wanted. So there was conversations from the beginning. And my impression from the outside was that it was sort of a race to see whether Spotify would develop its own recommendations team or get money enough to buy us first. And the money won. So we got acquired in 2014 and became what it was eventually called the personalization team at Spotify, although it didn't do just personalization, because in order to do personalization, you have to do a bunch of stuff to understand people's listening and what music means in order to recommend them stuff. So my funny role at the Echo Nest, which I got by sort of messing with things until people acknowledged that I was making them better and decided to not try to make me stop, was called Data Alchemist because my actual title was Principal Engineer, but that was just a level. Only when I would get interviewed about strange projects, they'd say, "Well, what's your job title?" And I'd say Principal Engineer. And then in the article the next day would say, "The Echo Nest's Principal Engineer." And because the two founders were engineers too, that was always really awkward and embarrassing to read this piece. And I'm like, I didn't tell them that I was the main one. Like, so I started saying I was Data Alchemist because then they had to ask me what that meant. And so what it officially meant was it was my job to try to experiment and see what we could make out of music data. So that was why I said alchemist and not scientist. Like a scientist is trying to find out the truth, and an alchemist is trying to make stuff into other stuff. So that's what I was supposed to be doing. And in theory, I would experiment and figure things out and then hand them over to, real engineering teams to run. And in practice, that did sometimes happen, but sometimes the real engineering team would be like booked 6 months in advance, and it wouldn't really require an engineering team to run things because I could do them. I could do a lot of things with BigQuery and some Python scripts. So I ended up a mix of prototyping things for other people to take and running things myself. And so along the way, I worked on things like the Spotify daily mixes, and the fans also like algorithm and the Spotify genre system. And I worked on Spotify Wrapped almost every year that it existed. And I sort of became the guy that you would ask when you didn't know who to ask things at Spotify, because sometimes I would know, and my time wasn't booked quite as rigorously as like real teams. So, if you ask a real team a question, they'll put you on a queue, and maybe they can get to you in next quarter. But if you ask me a question, I'd be like, I don't know, let me try it. Let me get back to you in 5 minutes. And sometimes that's not helpful, and what you need is a real team's answer a quarter from now. But sometimes what you need is like that guy's answer in 5 minutes.
Nice. So, I know that creating the genres was a big part of your role there, and most famously, the creating Every Noise, which for people that kind of aren't familiar, it is, from my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but it's basically you categorized all of the genres and subgenres and subgenres of Spotify. I believe there's over 6,000 categories of genre there. Everything from pop, of course, to like vegan straight edge and folktronica and Japanese chill pop, or Wyoming indie, which frankly, when I was going through these and I looked up Wyoming indie and I saw a playlist that had over 100 artists that supposedly were all from Wyoming, and I started looking at them and they were, I honestly didn't even know there was 100, no offense to people from Wyoming, but like that there was over 100 artists that had music out on Spotify from Wyoming. Talk a little bit about creating that, or what that is or was, and what went into all of that.
Yeah, so it started. All right, so back at the Echo Nest, radio was one of our most popular things, and most of it was track seeded or artist seeded radio, because this was 2011. So Pandora was sort of most people's model of like what online music radio was like. But at one point we had a customer who wanted genre radio. They're like, I just want like a few buttons so I can just hit like rock radio. I don't have to pick artists and tracks. And we're like, yeah, okay, that's sensible. We didn't have that, but we did have all these web scrapers that scraped every conceivable music related thing on the internet, and like did entity extraction to try to figure out what bands this page is talking about, and then keep track of what words are used to discuss which bands. So we had this enormous thing of, for any artist you can think of, these are the sort of the word frequencies of how people write about them on the web. And we were able to use that even at the Alchemist when we didn't have direct listening data. We were able to use that to calculate fan similarity. I mean, artist similarity based on how people are described. So when people asked us for genre radio, we're like, we don't have this, but it can't be too hard. Like, we know all the artists for whom rock, for example, is a frequently occurring term, and so we can just fire it up and say, give us the most popular rock artists, and hit play. And we got Rihanna. And we were like, okay, yes. People do use the word rock among many other words when they talk about Rihanna. I mean, she's got a song called Rockstar. She's got like songs with rock guitar in them. It's not wrong, but it's definitely not what that customer wanted to get when they hit the big rock radio button. So it was like Friday, and we were supposed to demo this on Wednesday, and we're like, oh, what are we going to do? But we had a table of interns from Tufts over in the corner, and I'm like, okay, maybe this will work. We just, for each of these like 20, obvious genres, we'll have the interns go find just 5 or 10 of the most obvious representative artists. Like, this is not hard work. They just go read the Wikipedia page on rock and just like, who are the 10 like obvious rock artists.
Sure.
And then we'll use our artist similarity graph and sort of say, well, if those are the 10 you mean by rock, then these are the collectively similar artists to those 10. And that ought to get us sort of in the neighborhood of rock. And we tried it and we're like, yeah, this is going to need some tweaking, but it was pretty plausible. And so that scheme evolved quite a bit over the years, but that's still basically how it worked all the ways up to 6,200 and however many genres, which is every genre gets on that map by some person. And in the beginning, it was mostly me, and later it was mostly one really great collaborator. But there a lot of people contributed, individual expertise. But some human said, "This is a thing we're going to include. This is what we're going to call it in this namespace." So they all have unique names, and here are some artists that explain what we mean by that. And for most of them, then we take those seed artists and we do some math to extrapolate and say, well, if those are the core of what you mean, then here are all the other artists that share the same audience, basically, as those artists. So that way you don't have to manually tag every artist in the universe. For some of those distinctions, like Wyoming indie, probably, the people who listen to those Wyoming indie bands probably secretly also listen to South Dakota indie bands or take a weekend in Colorado.
Yeah.
So some of them we just say, all right, no extrapolation. We'll pick them all. And, the trade-off for that is then you have to manually maintain it in the future too. But we had tools to help with that too. So conceptually, the idea is to think about genres as communities of artists or of fans or of practice. And it's usually some combination of those. But like Wyoming indie is a good example of a community of artists and listeners, but not necessarily, I mean, the indie-ness, implies there's some stylistic something, but I'm sure if you went through that playlist, you'd find that it is not particularly homogenous. Like, it probably has a great deal of stylistic variation. Whereas if you go to Gothic symphonic metal, those bands could be from all over, but they're going to sound a particular way. And the same with vegan straight edge. Like, those bands may be from different places, unified by their distaste for meat. But the straight edge part is going to mean that there's going to be a very consistent sound to that genre.
That's what I mean. That was my next question, is just like, what is vegan straight edge? And I do appreciate that you have a playlist that corresponds to each of these genres. And so you answered my question of a human, someone actually did come up with all of these names, which a lot of these I can't even pronounce. So I'm assuming it deals with like a different language or a made up word or something like that. But it is cool. And for people listening that haven't explored it, it's nice. You can go to everynoise.com and kind of look at this map, this kind of word bubble thing with the 6,000 plus playlist or genres rather all over the place, and you can filter and organize them and get a little samples of it, which I had a lot of fun kind of clicking around and listening to all the different genres that I'd never heard of before. And it is interesting that you talk about, I like kind of how you draw this line from, starting with rock, and we all kind of have an understanding that is a genre that's been around, for since the beginning of kind of releasing, music since like the 50s, I guess, is what we consider, modern day rock or rock and roll rock. We know what that means. But it is evolved from not just other genre names like indie rock, which maybe someone would argue maybe that's like 90s or early 2000s or something, or alt rock, or then post grunge and core. I think you had I searched this for a little bit. There's 170 genres with the word core in it.
Yes.
Which is fantastic. But it really is about, like you mentioned, communities. And I do feel like we've kind of evolved into kind of this post-genre listenership and behavior, at least. And that had become very apparent on Spotify over the years, as in, there were mood playlists, and it seemed like playlists, whether they were, the official editorial or algorithmic or whatever it was, it seemed like to follow communities, mood, just kind of attitudes, just what you're experiencing, and it wasn't as confined so much to traditional genres as we know it. How did it kind of connect from this list of 6,000 genres to the playlist that we kind of know and understand on Spotify? You mentioned a little bit of like daily mixes and whatnot, but how did this all connect?
Well, sometimes they don't. I mean, not everything on Spotify. Okay. I mean, Spotify, many of the features work in slightly different ways and use different inputs and different techniques. So daily mix does use genre information. That's how it breaks up your taste, basically. But Discover Weekly doesn't. Like, Discover Weekly doesn't take the genre system as an input at all. It might give you things that belong to the same genre, but it might not. And at any rate, it doesn't care, and it's not trying to. The mood playlists, on the one hand, it's sort of correct to say that they're genreless, but they're not really independent of genre entirely, because the things that you're receptive to are, for most people, are like a small subset of the things in the world. And you can find if you ever try an actual random playlist, a playlist of random songs, and I had one of those I made too, where I like literally randomly selected from the Spotify database 1,000 songs every day. It became very quickly obvious that most people don't know the variety of music that exists in the world. So what's mellow to you may not correspond with what's mellow to somebody in Vietnam or Angola. And, even if sort of the sonic parameters are similar, the difference in language and culture means that it may be more jarring than its sonic characteristics would indicate. So even mood things tend to be, not restricted to a genre, but still sort of helpfully constrained by a cloud of genres around what it is that you're used to. So that, if you're used to Perry Como, you don't get, cattle decapitation or vice versa.
Sure, that makes sense. How did this kind of evolve over the years in terms of its usage within Spotify, and uh, did listeners really? Uh, I've noticed the kind of that playlist over the years became more personalized, and more recently, I mean, even over the last year, more official editorial playlists that previously had said kind of created by Spotify now are like made for me, Ari Herstein, to list my name there. Speak to kind of the evolution of playlists from editorial to more personalized, where the algorithm kind of worked with all of this, and if it intersected with your work, with kind of the every
Yeah,
noise and all of
sure. So
this.
sort of going back to the beginning, Spotify began as basically a search box, and you could make your own playlists. But at the outset, like that was pretty much it. And the
Hmm.
acquisition of the Echo Nest sort of coincided with the beginning of algorithmic programming. And there was another acquisition about the same time of a company called Tunigo, which was a playlist making editorial company,
Mm.
which became the beginning of the editorial
Hmm.
effort. And at the beginning, they were totally separate.
Mm.
Like the editorial playlists were made by people, and Discover Weekly and then Release Radar and Daily Mix were made by Algorithm. No, no conversation between them. The the
Sure.
breakthrough idea, which was called algotorial, was to a human editor pick a pool of tracks, so tracks that made sense with a premise of a playlist, but then like instead of
Mm.
the human picking 50 tracks, the human might pick 500. And then instead of them being sequenced by the human, then the algorithm would take that pool of tracks and you're listening and use basically the same technique as Discover Weekly, but instead of pulling from the whole universe to surprise you, it would pull from this pool of
Hmm.
500 to try to get the variation on the theme that you would like. So like all out 80s,
Mm.
the goal is to give you the 80s that make sense to you. Now, the tricky part about that
Mm.
is the information that we have in Spotify, since it didn't exist in the 80s, is not what you listened to in the 80s, but what you listen to now. And so
Sure.
matching your current taste to a pool of 80s music may or may not give you the music that you listened to in the 80s. But it's at least hopefully closer to what you want to listen to than if the editor just picked a sort of canonical 50 tracks. And that approach is
Hmm.
very effective if you're measuring how long people listen to playlists and how often they come back.
Hmm.
So yeah, as you see, it has become more and more prevalent. There's still playlists that have a cultural function that sort of inherently
Hmm.
inimical to personalization. Like you could
Today's
right
top hits,
exactly
Rap
like Rap
Caviar.
Caviar. The point of it
Right.
existing is it's
Yep.
a common experience that we share together. And
Yep.
if yours was different than mine, it wouldn't make sense either for what it is or for artists. An artist wouldn't dream of getting on Rap Caviar if getting on Rap Caviar might mean they got shown to 3 people.
Right. 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 Which is funny and fascinating because once in a while we will see artists celebrating an editorial playlist that they get on, and then I'll go to that editorial playlist and I won't be able to find them, and it's this weird schism, kind of the era that we're in now, which I feel like this really just kind of became more prevalent over the last year, just from my vantage point. Whereas it seems now more editorial playlists than not are personalized, rather made for the
Yeah,
for
I mean,
me.
and for me as a music listener, I don't really want that. Like, I want to when I'm exploring music, I want to to see what's there. Like, I don't want to go to another city and have the city rearrange itself to put the burrito places in front of me. I want to see the food that they have. I want to see the place how it is.
Sure.
So I mean, that's sort of why there's no login on Every Noise, and those playlists are just what they are. They're not personalized, and I never wanted. I very specifically didn't want to personalize it. Like, if you go to Wyoming Indie, the point is to show you what the Wyoming indie community knows about Wyoming indie music, not what you know, because presumably you don't know anything. I certainly don't know anything. So
right.
Yeah.
And how does Every Noise connect to Spotify? Who is feeding information to whom? Is it Spotify to Every Noise to Spotify? And then I also noticed that the playlists that are listed on Every Noise, that they all correspond to, it's kind of the profile is the sounds of Spotify, which has actually over 7,000 playlists that are continuing to be updated. I'm curious who's updating those, how are those being updated, and just how all the systems work.
It all ran on code I wrote at Spotify that calculated those maps and the playlists and generated them and sent them out to my server. The maps, the playlists are just playlists on Spotify. Since I've been laid off, that server was shut down, and I moved the site to my own server, and so I no longer get those updates, which is why the new release section, which was one of the most valuable things for many people, no longer updates because there's no longer data flowing. The code's all still running. I mean, and this is how I know. Like, I check the playlists every week, and they updated again. So they haven't shut off my automation. It was all automated, so we'll see how long it keeps running. I expect that they'll eventually shut it down, but I don't have any insight into that. There's a section of Every Noise that's research tools that is based on the public Spotify API. So those things didn't rely on me being an employee, and those things still function.
Got it. And talk to, when you said the new release section was very valuable, how so, and how are people using it?
So the thing about new releases is there's a ton of them, as I'm sure you know, and it is prohibitively difficult to get that information from, like, there's just nothing in Spotify that will show you a list of 100,000 things. I mean, it just take like
a day.
The UI doesn't accommodate it, and the API doesn't accommodate it. That stuff is not confidential. Like, it's in everybody's interest, including Spotify's, for people to find new music. And so with internal access, I was basically able to route around the accessibility problem and find all those releases just, through internal database queries, and sort of reorganize them by genre, and then publish data files that way so you could see them.
Cool.
But that, I posted on the support forum because there are a couple of tweaks, like fairly small tweaks to the API that would allow that to be done without internal access. And I as a person who wants to know about new releases, I would be thrilled if they allowed that, but I'm not holding my breath.
Right. So it was filtered essentially every genre, all the 6,000 plus 6,200 that you had listed there. You could essentially filter those by new releases.
Yeah, or the other way around. Like, you could filter,
or new releases by the sub.
Pick any genre, and it would not only tell you what new releases came out this week by artists in that genre, but also, and this is the other thing that was really valuable, it would go through all the other artists who we weren't mapped to any of those genres, and using similar artist patterns, find the closest genre to them. So there'd be sort of two levels. Cool. And if you were interested in Gothic symphonic metal, then you'd get these are the Gothic symphonic metal releases this week. And then here's a bunch of other bands that may not be Gothic symphonic metal, but this is like the closest point we had to them. And I would go through like 4,000 releases, just scanning down it on Friday for my own purposes, and because it was super useful for cross-checking both how the genre system was working, and it was a great way to catch artist errors, especially because that display had a little row of album covers. And it's really cool and funny how often you could spot an error just scanning the album covers. It'd be like Grim Forest, Grim Forest, Grim Forest, girl in a bikini on a beach, Grim Forest, Grim Forest. You're like, I'm thinking that's not an atmospheric black metal album in the middle there.
Yep. That's funny. It is funny how artists, I think we'd like to believe that we are all so unique and individual, but most artists are a part of a community, a scene, and there are kind of guidelines, even if they don't want to admit them, to the not just the music, but aesthetic guidelines that most just inherently follow, and it's most visible, I would say. When you're at a show, the bands oftentimes dress in a certain way, they look a certain way, and then when they release music, like you said, the album cover all kind of feels a certain way. I mean, it was funny looking at some of these festival posters. I was like looking at this, I forget which festival it was, but I'm not really part of the metal core, deathcore scene or anything like that. But I saw somebody post a festival poster, and I couldn't read a single logo of any of the bands that were on there. It just looked like all tattoos, and to me, and I was like, oh, but it's just funny that that's kind of like there is that exists in all of them, so it makes a lot of sense. That kind of it all falls in. And then speaking of which, like, one of my favorite things to do is going through fans also like, and finding artists and going through that. And similarly, the profile photos are very similar for a lot of the fans also like to that, even with the coloring and the way the photo's shot, and whether it's a band or individual. And it's so fascinating to me, especially because I manage artists. I'm an artist. I have different projects. I'm friends with tons and tons of artists. And we like to think that, we're going on this creative excursion with a photographer to kind of come up with our promo photos. And it's like, you rent the peer space and you come up with mood boards and vision boards. And in the end, all of the promo photos are kind of looking the same of each genre. The fans also like it. It's like, what, do we all have this like creative epiphany all at once at the same time? But, it just shows how like we're all kind of influenced, musically, stylistically, aesthetically, culturally. I mean, it has a big part of all of this. Speaking of fans also like, I want to kind of get into that a little bit, because I noticed, I've been following probably more closely than most over the years of just how Spotify has discussed, how fans also like came to be, or what it was. And I know previously it dealt a bit with what you were speaking to before, kind of crawling the internet to see maybe what genres bloggers were writing about or something like that, or other artists, I should say, not genres, that they could be compared to. I'm curious how it works now, because I noticed a shift, and I think all artists noticed a shift last year, a dramatic shift, and the fans also like changed quite dramatically for at least the emerging, maybe mid-level artists. Maybe the pop superstars kind of stayed the same, but in my community, we noticed a massive shift, and I'm curious what happened.
Yes, I mean, this and genres were the two things that I worked on the longest in this whole span, and I worked on the similar artist algorithm, which was the core of this at the Echo Nest before we were acquired, and then when we got acquired, that one eventually became the new Spotify fans also like. It actually, I was super pleased when Spotify, I didn't do this, but when the people in charge of it changed the name of that from Related Artists to Fans Also Like, because I thought related, like related artists. Like, what does it mean related? Like, does that mean like we know each other, or we picked them, or they sound the same? It's like, it's unclear. But fans also, like, independent of how it worked, is like a very clear premise. It's like not under the artist's control. It's reporting.
Absolutely.
This is what the audience of this artist also likes. Now, there's no like automatic truth to that either. And, you know, they've changed the blog post now, but for years there was a Spotify blog post called How Spotify Fans Also Like Works, which was an interview with me explaining it. And for most of those years, like you said, and like I said, it was a combination of shared fans and shared descriptive terms. And it was still called Fans Also Like, and really the descriptive terms for popular artists were a fairly small factor. They really came into play with smaller artists who didn't have as many fans, or very small artists who have, you know, very few fans and they don't have any patterns. Then the web scrape stuff sometimes allowed us to get results where there was nothing. But the problem with the web scraping is knowing whether the mention of a name of a band in an article is a reference to that band. And, you know, the more unique your name, the more likely that is. But the less popular you are and the more generic your name, the more likely that there will be weird errors there. So, you know, sometimes that just didn't work. So the dramatic change that you noted was the point at which we finally retired the term, the scraping part, and literally made it Fans Also Like it says. And there were hiccups for about a week as we did the changeover. So some people panicked when things changed radically on a Tuesday or Wednesday or whatever. And there was a little chaos for like 3 or 4 days until everything settled down. And they were, for many artists, they were still pretty different afterwards. But they should be, that was sort of my final like triumphant project at Spotify before the layoffs is that. And I've, you know, it's a funny topic to talk about any individual case because people have their idea of who they are as an artist in the world, and what their fans do, they're not in control of and may be surprised by. And it's especially weird on Spotify because, you know, your song may get on a playlist whose audience is not your usual audience. And so you may be, you know, triumphant about the sudden burst of streams that you got from this playlist you got on, but that may produce weird effects. Suddenly your fans, your new fans, may also like things that you don't know about that were also on that playlist. So, you know, part of that transition, I would always...
If you could get a little bit more...
saying part of that transition, the build up to it, I mean, the only reason we did that transition is I'd spend months, you know, comparing iterations that algorithm and across hundreds of artists of all kinds and tiers to iterate it to the point where I thought it was the best it could be. So when we did the transition, I was super confident that the new version was better, like overall, very strongly better than the old version. But that doesn't, you know, that it's still surprising. Like if you had absorbed your old list and come to think of those as your people, and then I yanked them out from you and said, no, sorry, with better math, we suddenly discovered these are your people, then like that's a weird experience to have.
Yeah. I mean, can you speak to a little bit more specifically how it works? Is it based on follower overlap, who fans are following? Is it based on who fans are actively listening to, who the fans are like? How is the Fans Also Like? How does it work? How is it actually working now?
I don't think I'm allowed to say in detail because the new blog post that Spotify put up is not as detailed as the old one. But I can sort of tell you philosophically the way it's supposed to work is not just listeners, but fans. So substantial listening, more than one track, coming back over time and following, those are all good signs of fandom, as opposed to someone who's just like passively heard a song or two on a playlist. So it tries to pick really the fans of each artist and see how really the fans overlap in an attempt to not be misled by very casual listening.
Interesting. Yeah, it is surprising. That is a good word for it, especially for some of the more emerging or mid-level artists. From what I had been hearing and witnessing, actually firsthand, is previously artists maybe were a little bit more aligned with their fans. Also, like artists were kind of in a similar popularity level, let's just call it. Maybe they all had, let's say, around 30,000 monthly listeners, and similar genre, similar feel. And then when this flip happened, I noticed, a lot of people noticed that their fans also, like, some of the artists had only 100 monthly listeners. And I was like, well, that's weird. And then some of the other ones haven't been active for a few years. And to be frank, I even saw some of my friends were asking me, like, this just feels like my friends who are in my phone right now. Like, is Spotify pulling my contacts list? Like, we don't sound anything alike, but they're all just my friends. And I was like, I looked at it and I was like, you make a good point, because these artists don't sound similar at all. And they actually, the popularity are all over the place, because one would have 50,000 monthly listeners. The other would have 50, literally. I documented a lot of this. And I was like, man, I have no idea. You're right. I maybe Spotify is pulling your phone contacts. I have no idea. I mean, I would imagine not, but like, that's why I'm just so curious at what happened.
It's just, I mean, again, I'm only speaking about how it was before I left. But it pulls no external information. It's just that the only interesting logic is in what constitutes a fan of this artist. How much listening, how much of a bonus is it to follow an artist, and then combining them. And that part is the same as it was before, and that it's a combination of number of artists in common and what share of each artist's fan base those are. And from my point of view, the goal, this is just my opinion, the goal of that system is to basically take you deeper into the world as you go. So for me, it's good and expected that in general, your fans also like artists. Not all of them, but in general, they'll be a little less popular than you. So that as you go, you go deeper. Because otherwise, you end up, just everything leads to Taylor Swift. So my goal was, everything can, if you start it, to do this conceptual exercise, if you start at Taylor Swift and follow all of her fans also like, and follow all their fans also like, in the abstract, you eventually find all artists. It won't actually work because, of course, many of the artists don't have enough data to have fans also like. But that's kind of the idea.
Yeah, I mean, I that makes sense. I guess, as an artist, and also from what I've been hearing from the community, it was startling, and in not a welcomed sense, I will say, because previously it was almost a point of pride of the artists and their fans also, like, who they were surrounded by, and you felt, all right, I'm onto something. I'm amongst my peers, or at least those that the community I want to be part of. And then when kind of the proverbial rug got pulled out from under them and all of this changed, it was startling in the sense it's like, oh wow, like you said, that all my fans also like are far less popular than me right now. They're not even similar genres. They're my friends, and sure, we might have overlap because we played a show together once 3 years ago, and all those people are maybe, they're friends with us, and friends want to support friends, and, I'm trying to break away from that. And so it was kind of, that was a bit startling and less welcomed in the artist community, I shall say.
I mean,
Yeah.
Like I said, I was and remain confident that the new system is better overall. But
Yeah.
that's no consolation at all if
Yeah.
for any individual experience.
No, and sure. And I'm actually curious, and I'm going to throw a wonky use case at you, anecdote, and I'm curious if you'd be able to solve this for me, because I can't solve this. We all know that there's bots exist, and there's artificial streaming, and there's bot attacks and all of this, and something that's been really affecting the artist community lately, that I've been documenting a little bit, and researching and just discussing. There's all these random bot attacks that are happening to artists that artists have no control over. And for instance, a few of the artists that I manage, like, we're not hiring playlisting services or marketing agencies, or literally doing anything. And just like one day you'll see like a very random spike of, a couple hundred streams for this song to like thousands and thousands on one song. You're like, oh wow, like what's happening? And this is pretty frequent now, and unfortunately artists kind of, we're kind of powerless to stop this. And I'm talking to distributors, and I'm talking directly to, my contacts at Spotify and labels and marketing. We're kind of all throwing our arms up, just like, what do we do? Because nobody really knows or figured it out. But a use case, something that happened oddly to an artist that I managed actually a week ago, was I noticed one of the songs, and I'm curious if you can tell me how this possibly happened. One of the songs on one day, and this is not one of her popular songs. This was kind of the hidden track on the album. It's a minute long. It was a voice memo. It went from 200 streams a day on average to 5,000 on one day. And I monitor my Spotify for artists every day, and I'm looking at this, and I was like, oh wow. And I looked to the source of where all those came from, and it was Spotify's radio. It was all algorithmic, Spotify algorithm, all radio. I was like, oh wow, sweet. Like, even though it's not one of the songs we were prioritizing, like, that's awesome. It got Spotify algorithm. That's like the holy grail. We want to get songs like, favorable within the algorithm. And mind you, I wasn't running discovery mode or anything like that would kind of artificially like juice up the radio or anything like that. And then what was weird was the next day it fell off radio and popped back down to about 200 streams that day. But her fans also completely changed from, similar artists that she knows and they know, and probably very accurately the fans also like, to all of these. They look like fake artists. I'm like looking at all of these artists, and each of them have less than 1,000 monthly listeners. They have 2 to 4 songs on their profile, and each song has like 5 to 10,000 streams. The album art's all over the place. The names are all over the place. They all look like, I was researching them, none of them look like they're real artists. And I couldn't figure it out. And no one I talked to could possibly figure out what happened, because it wasn't like all the bot attacks that I've seen before. It's like, oh, you got thrown on a playlist that had bots on it or whatever. Like, okay, I would have seen that playlist or something spike, or, there's all these random various attacks, and I've researched this a bit, and I kind of know what's out there. This was something I'd never seen, where it was Spotify's radio that said it was generating all of it, and it was all Spotify. It became like 85% Spotify algorithmic plays, and then it changed the entire fans also like. So I'm curious if you could speak to that.
Well, just as you describe it, I can't really explain it, because it would take a little more than one day for the fans also to pick up on that. I mean, that was sort of part of the point of defining fans by, fans as opposed to casual listeners. So literally the part about randomly being picked by the algorithm, like, that's a real thing that, most of those algorithms have a fair amount of randomness to them. They're not supervised by human editors curating or checking tracks. So yeah, and especially if there's a test running at any moment, one of those things could be part of a test to anything you can think of, pull songs from deeper, less popular songs than it usually would, or maybe only less popular songs, or only songs longer than 4 minutes, or only songs longer than 2 minutes, or more songs that are of some sort. So any day, any weird thing could happen because somebody's trying something, or just because, the bits happen to align and picked this song. Here's the hard thing about fraud, music fraud in general. It's usually pretty easy to find. That was my experience. And I never wanted to be like a fraud fighter. It was never my intent at all. But anytime I would go do something that would try to find interesting patterns, some of those patterns would end up being not the patterns I was looking for. So the first time this happened, I was trying to look at listening by city and say, all right, what's like disproportionately popular in every city? That's interesting. And it was interesting, except in some places it was like totally weird. And I was like, what the hell is going on? I can't believe this music. What is this music? And I can't believe it's really popular here. And also, what the hell is this town? And I go look it up and be like, nobody lives here. What? Why? Oh, there's an Amazon data center there. Interesting.
Oh, yeah.
So,
gotcha.
These days, there's a very real, very dedicated fraud team at Spotify, and streaming fraud is not the most sophisticated of organized crimes. So finding it and getting rid of it is not that difficult. But knowing why it's happening, like who the people are and what their goals are, is much, much harder. So if your artist is hit by a bot attack started by somebody else, there's basically no way to tell the difference between that and, you built the bots by hand and trained them yourself in their evil ways and set them on your master scheme for world domination. So yeah, you can get caught up in things and the other thing, you can get like taken down or flagged for fraud if it's not your doing, because it's really hard to know whose doing it is.
Yeah, it is a pain point right now for a lot of artists, especially independent artists, because we're kind of helpless in this scheme of legitimate fraudsters out there that are trying to game the system, and it's kind of the whole model to me seems pretty broken right now, because I'm hearing almost every day artists getting their songs taken down for artificial streaming and fraud, and then I talk to those artists and they didn't do anything to try to influence that, and I know they're telling the truth because we're friends, and actually has happened to me and my artists, and I didn't do anything, and so it's this weird thing, but I more so, why I bring it up to you is I was curious how that could have affected changed the fans also like so dramatically, so quickly, considering, like you said, it's really fans and not just casual listenership. So my takeaway, and correct me if I'm wrong, is someone at Spotify must have changed this fans also like algorithm since you left.
It could be. I'd be surprised.
Maybe.
But I was surprised to be laid off, so we've established I could be surprised.
Yeah, right. Or what would be the other? Yeah, it's like I'm trying to get to the bottom of this. Mostly because of like I'm trying to help artists, and my whole angle is just like, how do we help artists? Zoomed completely out, how do we help artists succeed in the new music business, and how we help them have careers? And because Spotify is the dominant streaming platform for discovery, for listenership, for growth, for everything, that's kind of where most artists are devoting most of their efforts right now. And it's when these kinds of things happen and we feel like we don't have control, I'm trying to find solutions and at least, even if not solutions, at least some understanding, so artists aren't aren't driving themselves crazy, which is what's happening right now. Like I'm driving myself crazy with this, like, these bot attacks, and like trying to figure out the fans also like them. Like, well, how do I get it back to where it was? And I have just like, I'm throwing my hands up. And it's like, man, I have no idea.
Yeah, I think that's true. I don't have any. I think the industry needs more human processes. Like that's where this fell down. Like weird stuff is going to happen. Like, but we're not really going to prevent. I mean, nobody wants the weird stuff to happen, but it's going to happen because it's like humans programming computers, and we're kind of good at it, but like not that good. So stuff happens, but it's the point after which it happens. Like the sad part of this story to me is you can't get an answer, and that's true. Like you don't have nearly the amount of information or the angles in the information you would need to figure this out, nor do I from the outside. And the people that do are probably too busy. Like there's no structure set up for, what you want is to be able to flag this back to Spotify and say, hey, something is weird here, and get an explanation or a remediation. Like ideally you want someone to say, oh, here, I see what happened. Yeah, you're right. It was a bot attack, and we can back out those streams, and then this effect will be gone. Or maybe it wasn't. Like, two things happen. It's very plausible to think that one caused the other, but sometimes, I spent a lot of time investigating these things when I was there, and often the obvious explanation would be correct, and sometimes it wouldn't. And I'd be like, I'd spend an hour trying to track down how these artificial streams caused this, and fail, and be like, and then finally realize, it wasn't that. Like that happened, and at the same time, some other like subtle thing that you're not thinking of, like some of those things look back 6 months, for example, and so it turns out that like the event happened 6 months ago, and it's the fact that it rolled out of the span of the algorithm that produced the change. Only you've long since forgotten about whatever that was. So yeah, it's hard, and I think you're absolutely right to complain about it and want better information. Like,
I will keep complaining about it until we have some kind of answer or solution or something, because it's gotten it's the Wild West, and it's gotten kind of untenable for a lot of artists, and especially with I've been hearing. You could have rival artists or your enemies could pay, a little bit of money and put your songs in, do a bot attack against somebody else and get all of your songs ripped down because you have an enemy. And it's just like that shouldn't happen.
I remember back when the first official fraud team started at Spotify, and I went over to Stockholm for a week to help them get started. And one of those afternoons we sat in a conference room, and the leader of the new team was like, all right, let's make a list of all the ways that people might, all the fraudulent cheating things people might do. And I'm like, I'm glad we got a lot of whiteboards, because basically anything of perceived value, someone will try to cheat their way into it. So the list of potential vectors of abuse is like the list of features. It's like people will try to get on charts, or they'll try to get streams, or they'll try to get on fans also like, or they'll try to get undiscovered by, or they'll try to get their playlist higher in search. Just list all the things that it does. And if they benefit somebody, probably somebody will try to game their way into more of whatever it is. If fraud was only ever to make money, that it would make it much simpler to combat, because it would always have to be this one thing. But then, I'd go investigate things, and I'd be like, that doesn't make sense. Like, they're not going to make any money this way. And I'm like, oh, they're not trying to make money. They're trying to do this other thing.
Right. And now it's evolved so much that it's people kind of now understand that you can because Spotify and the distributors are so cautious, and they are penalizing now people and distributors and artists for artificial streaming, it is used as a weapon, and for some communities and some artists, and it's just also, from my understanding, even artists that don't seem to have any enemies or anything like that, it's like it's used as a scam. There's some companies that are scamming artists out there, and to promote for promotion services, or something else I've seen is, an artist a spike will happen, or they'll get included in playlists, or you won't even know where these spikes or these listeners are happening, and they all seem legitimate. They're like Western countries. These fraudsters have gotten really good. It's like I look at it, it's like, oh wow, there's like, it's US and it's France and it's UK. It's like, okay, this looks like not a bot farm in Indonesia, like I'd previously see. Is like, oh, that looks fishy. They're all Western countries, and then the fraudster, the scammer, will slide into the artist's DM and be like, hey, I wanted to just show you what I could do. If you pay me, I'll keep doing this for you. And I'm getting you legitimate fans or whatever. And they're like, oh, okay. And then, and sometimes they slide in and sometimes they don't. And then it's like, oh man, there's just like the scams out there. The artists are dealing with are just wild.
Yeah. People are disappointing.
So, yeah. Yeah, that's a nice takeaway. People are disappointing. Well, Glenn, this has been a really, really fascinating, illuminating conversation, and I really appreciate you sitting down with me to talk through all of this. And it's just like, being able to see behind the curtain of everything that you developed and built, and it's so fascinating and really helpful, I think, just at understanding how all of this works. The most powerful streaming platform in the world, that is guiding so much of the not just the culture, but the ecosystem and the community, and just at an individual level, kind of just the artistry, more or less. And it's fascinating. And I'm curious for you, kind of what is next. I know that you have a book coming out, I believe, and I'm curious to kind of hear. I'm definitely going to read it, but I'm curious, like, maybe if you could speak to a little bit about the book and just
Sure.
maybe what's next for you.
I'm sort of amused by the fact that I'm temporarily between computer programming jobs, but I have a book coming out. So I'm officially an author, a professional author at the moment, at least for now. So the book is called You Have Not Yet Heard Your Favorite Song, How Streaming Changes Music. Mm-hmm. And it's basically my explanation of why I think streaming is good for music and music streaming is good for humanity. So I do a little bit of background in it, but then it basically has two big sections. One about the new fears that streaming provokes in people. And I sort of go through them and talk about either why you shouldn't be, maybe they're not really different than what they were before, or maybe you shouldn't be afraid of them, or maybe you should be more afraid of them than you realize. And then a sort of mirror counter chapter of the new joys that streaming makes possible, or collective listening make possible. And I wrote it while I was at Spotify, but it's not a Spotify book. It's not about Spotify, the company. It's about streaming music as a cultural phenomenon. And there's some Equinest stories in it. The Rihanna rock radio story is in there.
Sure.
But yeah, it's sort of my explanation of my faith.
Cool. Nice. So I can't wait to read it. When is it coming out? June. Okay, great. Well, we'll look out for it. Amazing. Well, I have one final question that I ask everybody who comes on the show, and that is, what does it mean to you to make it in the new music business?
This is a funny question for me, because I don't have personal business goals for my participation in the music business. Like, it was fun to be paid to work on stuff, but it was fun to write a music column for 10 years that nobody was paying me for. It's fun to work on my little music tools still, even though I no longer work for the company whose API it is. I mean, I've spent my career as a computer person, so even when I was working at Spotify, my personal goals, I mean, they weren't counter to the business's goals, but they didn't they weren't linearly connected to the business goals. Like I didn't do anything to make the stock price go up or down, nor did I regard that as a measure of my success. For me, success in music is I want to hear all the songs everywhere. And I love hearing things I haven't heard before and thinking about what those things mean to the people who made them and like what's happening between us when someone sings and I hear it, or play an instrument and I hear it, or someone hears it. So, and this is sort of what the book is about too. My goal for music is that the potential of having all the world's music connected is better fulfilled and reduces the distance between us and like helps everybody understand that other people are people. Because it's one thing to be afraid of people that you've never met. But I think food and music are the two things that just cut through that otherness so quickly. You're like, what are they in? Pick a place, and then you hear their music, and you're like, oh, well, whatever they are, they've got cool music. Like they do hip hop slightly differently. So maybe I was afraid of them before, but but before we fight, can you play me another one of those songs? And oh, what do they eat there? And like, well, that's actually that's kind of delicious. So I mean, this is very grandiose, but I think music and food are part of the way we get to the point where we're not bombing each other anymore, any of us. That's like a lot of responsibility to put on streaming services or Ticketmaster or like any company that's intermediating in this process. And that's, as an employee of one, I took my responsibility to be a steward of culture and humanity pretty seriously. But, business goals are not, that's not how business goals are oriented. The financial report never says, well, there was a reduction in the amount of hostility in the world. So it shouldn't matter whether our ad-supported podcast business broke even or not. It doesn't really work that way.
Well, I think you and I and everybody else listening to this right now are aligned in the sense that we believe that music can save the world, or at least have a part of softening humanity a little bit. So thank you for that. And thank you for chatting with me. That was great. Thanks, Glenn. Today's episode was edited by Ari Davids, with music by Brassroots District, and produced by all the great people at Ari's Take.